friends, welcome to Organic True Crime with Sydney Hopes, where I talk about interesting true crime stories. And today, this month I've been focusing on cannibals, and today I'm going to be talking about the vampire of Sacramento, Richard Chase, who I had heard of before only as a killer who only attacked people who left their doors unlocked because he felt like it was an invitation to him, which is true, but there is so much more to the story than that. So just a warning now, it is a very gruesome story. There are a lot of very gory facts that I have to include, just so you know. So get ready for Richard Trenton Chase, the vampire of Sacramento. So Richard Trenton Chase was born in May of 1950. His parents were very, very strict, and his father was pretty abusive. He did have one younger sister, which I couldn't find any information about her, but she probably doesn't really want to be associated with him, which I understand, so we'll leave it at he had one younger sister. As a child, he did wet the bed for a really long time, I think until he was about 8. And in a lot of situations of abuse, that wetting the bed tends to be a trigger. Just keeping that in mind, knowing that he did have an abusive father, and he did wet the bed for a long period of time. And he also was known to set fires and started abusing and killing animals at a very, very young age. And those three things, wetting the bed, setting fires, and abusing animals at a young age, are all used to be known as like main red flags of someone that's going to become a serial killer, basically. It's not really thought of as true anymore, but I still thought it was interesting to note that he did show all of these signs. His mother did suffer from mental illnesses, and she did seek help at least once during his childhood. She apparently very often accused her husband of cheating on her and also of trying to poison her. So that's something that Richard was exposed to for like his whole childhood. At some point when Richard was pretty young and he was showing all these signs of mental illnesses, his parents did take him to see someone like a psychiatrist. But when they suggested that he needed a more intensive treatment, possibly hospitalization, they both refused and took him out of treatment. When Richard was about 12 or 13 years old, his family was really struggling financially, and this is when his mother started seeing a psychiatrist, so they were also struggling emotionally. And they did actually end up losing their house around this time, but eventually they did find some sort of stability again after this. So, Richard Chase suffered from erectile dysfunction. He was unable to get an erection, which he did eventually seek treatment for, but he noticed a long time before that happened. When he was younger, probably about in middle school, and started learning about these things, and he learned that an erection comes from blood flow. He felt that the way to fix his problem was to increase the amount of blood that he had in his body, and this is why he started abusing and killing animals, was to consume their blood so that he would have more blood flow, because he felt like that would help. When Richard was in high school, his mother really encouraged him to have a social life. I'm sure she was worried that he didn't really have friends, understandable from a mother's point of view, but the forced social life that Richard was put into ended in drug and alcohol abuse, unfortunately, and this did not help with his untreated mental illnesses that they knew he had and were again just going untreated. Richard was known for consuming lots of marijuana and also regularly taking LSD. And also around this time, Richard developed hypochondria, which is when you constantly believe that you have some sort of illness or something wrong, and like believe to the extent that you feel the effects of it. So over the years, Richard told doctors that he was suffering from some of the following. One being that his blood was slowly turning to powder, and sometimes he would claim that this was happening because of someone poisoning him. He also thought that sometimes his heart would stop and that he was basically a zombie for a little bit. He also at some points claimed that someone had stolen his pulmonary artery. And at other times, he thought that his cranial bones, his skull, had split apart and was shifting and would move around. And he even at one point in his life shaved his head so that he could watch the movements. But again, this didn't really get treated. And of course, all of those things didn't happen while he was in high school. This was throughout his whole life that he complained of these things. But he did start showing signs of and developing hypochondria about when he was in high school. In 1965, when Richard was 15 years old, he was arrested for marijuana possession, and he was sentenced to work on weekends for 1 year for that. And then 3 years later, in 1968, he graduated from high school just barely. He was known to make very, very low grades, but just enough to pass. So he did graduate, and he enrolled in American River College after graduating from high school. And this time is when he actually went to a doctor and was diagnosed with and seeking treatment for his erectile dysfunction. The doctors felt that it was coming from his suppressed anger, but he never actually did seek any treatment from this. He was diagnosed, and that was about it. I believe he felt that he was treating it himself, although it had been quite a while that he had been noticing signs, and things apparently weren't changing because he was still going to a doctor for it. But anyway, he felt he was treating it on his own. In 1971, when Richard was 21 years old, he lived with some roommates in an apartment. At this time, his parents were paying his rent and all of his bills because he didn't have a job. He was supposed to be going to school. I'm not sure if he was or not. He didn't ever graduate, so I'm not sure when he actually stopped going. But anyway, he was living in an apartment with some roommates. And very shortly after living with him, his roommates began to have complaints about his behavior. Richard was known for having very, very poor hygiene and just having some very strange habits. He was also constantly on drugs, which is why they kind of kept him around for a while, because it was the 70s. They liked having parties. He was always on drugs, which meant he always had drugs. So they kind of kept him around to have better parties, and just used him and his strange behavior that came from untreated mental illnesses. But by May of that year, his roommates had had enough and it just wasn't worth it anymore. So they asked him to leave. They asked him to move out, and he refused. So instead, they all moved out and left him by himself in the apartment. And Richard's parents could not afford to pay for this apartment by themselves, so he ended up being forced to move back home. This actually didn't last very long, though. I guess his behavior also bothered his family, so they ended up putting him up somewhere else. This is also when Richard developed a fear of having a lack of vitamin C. His solution was to take an orange and squish it up against his head so that his brain could absorb it through, I want to say diffusion, because isn't osmosis only when it's water, or is it osmosis? I don't know. It's been a long time since I was in a science class. Please let me know. Anyway, he thought his brain could absorb it best by him squishing an orange against his head. In 1972, when Richard was 22 years old, his parents got divorced because his mother was convinced that her husband was cheating on her and also trying to poison her. He spent an equal amount of time between the two, and eventually, like I said, they did start paying for another apartment for him to live in. Also in this year, Richard went on a trip to Utah by himself, where he was arrested for a traffic violation. I couldn't find any more information on that other than he did have an arrest for some sort of traffic violation in Utah. But he didn't serve any time for it. I think he probably just paid a fine. His parents probably paid a fine, The next year, in 1973, Richard was attending a party when he fondled a girl without permission, and he was asked to leave, which he did, but then he came back to the party, and at this point, the people there called the cops on him. And when the cops showed up and were escorting him out, a gun fell from his belt, and he was arrested. I'm not sure where the gun came from at this point, but I do know that his father came and bailed him out of jail this time. Later that year, when he was 23 years old, he went to live with his grandma for a little bit in LA, but she sent him home after a couple months because she didn't like his behavior, which isn't that like the exact same thing that happened with Jeffrey Dahmer? Anyway, thought that was interesting. It's not exactly the same, but still. Later that year, he went to a hospital complaining, saying that his pulmonary artery had been stolen, and they checked him into a psych ward because this was not possible, and he obviously needed some other kind of help. But his mother came and checked him out pretty shortly after, so he still didn't really receive any treatment at this point. Early 1975, Richard was admitted to a psychiatric hospital again. This time he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. He was actually admitted as a schizophrenic suffering from somatic delusions. But he did not stay very long, because by the next year, in early 1976, he was living in his own apartment again with his parents paying for his bills, and his father came to visit him and found him to be very, very sick. Richard had apparently been regularly purchasing rabbits, which he would take home and not only drink their blood, but also inject himself with their blood. And then he would eat the raw remains. And this made him very, very sick. So his father took him to the hospital, and he was admitted for blood poisoning. But then he was sent to an institution for his paranoid schizophrenia. And this is when he first gets his vampire nicknames. The staff in the hospital that he was staying in called him Dracula because they kept finding dead birds outside of his room, outside of the window, and he would also often be found with blood smeared on his face, and he would say that he just cut himself shaving, but they knew that that was not true. And after only 4 months of being in this hospital, where the staff admitted to being afraid of him because of his actions, again, after only 4 months, he was released. They felt that they had rehabilitated him enough and put him on the correct medication, and he was released. Which might have been a failed judgment on somebody's part, but I mean, you don't know until it's too late, right? After he was released, Richard went to live in his own apartment again with his parents paying the rent and his bills, and his mother would just bring him his groceries, but he apparently never let her inside the apartment. He would just meet her outside and take the groceries from her, and then she would leave. But in 1977, when Richard turned 27 years old, his parents' court-ordered conservatorship over him ended, and they no longer were legally responsible for him. So his mother gave him like $1,500 and came up with like a plan for him to live on his own. Most of that money he did end up using to buy himself a car. I'm pretty sure it was an old pickup truck, but I'm not 100% sure. Anyway, he bought himself a vehicle. And in August of that year, police found him near Lake Tahoe, covered in blood. Some sources say he was naked, some don't. He was covered in blood, and he had a bucket of organs with him. But those organs were determined to have come from a cow, not a person, so police didn't really care, and nothing was really done from it. They're just like, oh, okay, wasn't a person, you're fine. And very shortly after this, Richard started stealing people's dogs, and he would call the people afterwards and harass them after stealing their pet to drink its blood and eat it. He also purchased a few dogs on his own to do the same thing. In December of 1977, Richard purchased a gun. He was forced to wait 16 days before he could actually pick it up. They had to check his credentials, I guess. And I guess his crime history didn't matter because he was given the gun. It was legally purchased and registered in his name. And that brings us to December 29th of 1977, when Richard claimed that he was feeling especially upset and lonely because his mother hadn't allowed him to come home for Christmas that year. He got in his car and he came upon 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin, who was carrying groceries into his house. When Richard drove up, stopped the car, fired 2 shots out of his car, and then quickly sped away. One of these 2 shots did end up, or one of the 2 bullets did end up hitting Ambrose Griffin in the chest and proved to be fatal. Police didn't really have anything to go off of at that point. It was just a random drive-by. Nobody knew anyone that would have been upset with him, and nobody really saw him. Ambrose's wife was already in the house. She was also carrying in groceries, but she was already in the house, and he was still in the yard, walking towards the door. And about a month later, on January 23rd, 1978, Richard broke into a family's home, He stole a few items. He also urinated in a drawer full of child's clothing, and then he defecated on a child's bed. The family actually returned home while he was still there and found him. The father attacked him, but Richard ran. He ran through the neighborhood and checked doors until he found an unlocked front door. Richard later reported or said that he felt like an unlocked front door was an invitation to him, that they were inviting him to enter the home and do as he pleased. So when he came upon the home of David and Teresa Wallen and found the door to be unlocked, he went ahead and went right in. When Richard entered the home, he found 22-year-old Teresa Wallen, who was actually 3 months pregnant at the time. She was holding a trash bag on her way to take it out. Sorry, my baby monitor is beeping. She was holding a trash bag on her way to take it out when Richard shot 3 times. He hit her once in the hand, once in the neck, and once in the head. And then he approached her and shot her one final time in the temple at point blank range. He then took her body and placed it in bed, where he removed her organs, placed them into a bucket, and then took them in the bathroom and bathed in all of the organs and blood. Then he went and took a yogurt container out of the trash and used that to drink some of her blood. And then he went out to the yard and gathered some dog poo and placed it in her mouth before leaving. And that is how David Wallen found his pregnant wife when he returned home that day. His car had actually broken down on the way home from work, and he ended up being like a half an hour to an hour late. And one thing that I found was kind of odd was David says that he entered his house and he found that his dog was just sitting in the living room, and then he saw the trash on the floor and stains and followed them and found his wife. But I don't understand. They had a German Shepherd, and I just thought it was kind of odd because Richard was known for killing dogs very, very often. And he just left it there, and also that it didn't intervene at all, or maybe it did, and Richard just never told that part. I don't know. But he did end up leaving a footprint there, which didn't really lead to much at first, but it was at least noted. A few days later, Richard either stole or purchased, I've seen it written as both, he obtained 2 puppies. He drank all their blood and then left their bodies out on a front lawn near the Wallen home. January 27th, 1978. Evelyn Mirath, I'm so sorry if I'm saying her name wrong. Evelyn and her 6-year-old son Jason were at home babysitting Evelyn's nephew David, who was just under 2 years old. Their neighbor, Dan Meredith, was also at the home. He was helping with the babysitting, and he was watching the boys while Meredith went to take a bath, and this is when Richard entered through the unlocked front door. It's thought that Dan heard him opening the door because he was shot and killed in the entrance hallway of the home. Jason ran to his mother's room, and this is where he was also shot and killed. I'm not sure when or where, but at some point the baby Jason was also shot and killed. Richard then shot Evelyn and took her body and placed it on the bed. This is when he raped her and then removed all of her organs and drank her blood. I do think it's important to note that this was the only time that he participated in necrophilia. Anyway, there was a little boy down the street that had scheduled a play date with Jason that day, so he came and knocked on the door, and this interrupted Richard, and he fled, and a lot of neighbors saw him leaving the scene, and they gave police a description of an extremely skinny white man, and that's all they really had until a few days later. Richard tried to steal someone's car at like a grocery store parking lot, but the person he tried to steal a car from actually had gone to high school with him and recognized him and told the police his name. And this is when they realized that he perfectly fit their profile for the person they were looking for. He lived alone, he was very, very skinny and possibly malnourished. He had record of being violent and having mental illnesses and going to jail and having weapons. He really just, everything checked all of their boxes. So They went to his home and knocked on the door. They didn't have an actual warrant. They didn't technically have any evidence against him. So they went and knocked on his door and he didn't answer. But they could hear him moving around inside. They knew he was home, so they decided just to kind of hide and wait. And eventually Richard did leave. He was actually carrying a box of bloody rags when he saw the police hiding, or they jumped out, I don't know, but he saw them and he dropped his box and he ran. They pretty quickly tracked him down or caught him, and they found that he had the wallet of Dan Meredith on his person, so he was immediately arrested for the murder. When he was taken in for questioning, he immediately confessed to everything. He showed absolutely no remorse, and he told all the stories in a very matter-of-fact, concrete way. So after taking Richard into custody, police got a warrant and returned to his home to search it. And this is where they found collars and leashes from all the pets he had stolen. They found things from the previous people he had killed from their homes as well. They found that his refrigerator was full of animal remains. They were put into containers, at least. They weren't just thrown in there, but full of animal remains. And on his bed, there was a plate with pieces of brain on it. And I did read somewhere that it was human brain, but only in like one place, so I'm not quite sure that it was, but it was brain. They said that almost every single thing everywhere in the apartment was stained with blood. It was just really disgusting. But they did not find the body of the 2-year-old David. His body had not been found at the house. He was missing, and it had also not been found in Richard's home. And Richard, of course, did not tell them where it was or help in any way. And unfortunately, the body was not found for months later. It was in March when the decapitated body of 2-year-old David was found in a cardboard box in a vacant lot. The next year, January of 1979, Richard went to trial for the murder of 6 people. He pled not guilty by reason of insanity, but 2 separate psychiatrists deemed that he was in fact sane at the time of the crimes, which doesn't exactly mean sane, but really more means that he was aware that what he was doing was wrong and did it anyway. So he did stand trial. He actually ended up taking the stand to defend himself, which is not usually a good idea. The trial lasted 4 months, but it only took the jury 5 hours to deliberate before returning and finding that he was guilty. Richard was sentenced to death and was sent to death row in San Quentin Penitentiary. Anyway, he was briefly transferred to a psychiatric ward where he was given some medication and then returned to death row in San Quentin. And he ended up stockpiling his antidepressants. He stopped taking them and was just saving them and hiding somewhere until December of 1980 when he overdosed and was found dead in his cell. And that is Richard Chase, the vampire of Sacramento. I don't even know what to say because I usually have some kind of like, well, did they deserve it? But absolutely, yes, he did horrible, awful, terrible things. And I know he was mentally ill and that he, at several points in his life, tried to seek treatment and it just he didn't really receive proper treatment. And possibly if he had, it wouldn't have happened. But we don't know that. What we do know is what did happen. And that is a tough one. I hope you enjoyed hearing it, though. It's an interesting one. It's unique, to say the least. He truly was a vampire, I guess. I mean, but not really. It was really just the blood drinking that earned him that name, and it's fun for media to give murderers nicknames, right? I don't know. Anyway, Richard Trenton Chase, everyone. I hope to see you again next time. Bye!